lot of fun together when we wait for the money.
It's quite easy to forget about individual games in a franchise sometimes. Once they become locked into a yearly schedule, games in a long-standing catalog can often seem like a blur. What game went where, which one was the best, and what did each game do for the franchise? Questions we often seek answers for as the years go by. Sometimes the uniqueness gets forgotten, or how much one particular game helped build up, repair, or restabilize ideas that may not have been fleshed out all the way in games leading up to it. Or which game was the best possible version of a franchise, even long after it had been forgotten. Far Cry is one of those franchises that quickly became a household name with its first 5 mainline titles and a handful of spin-offs and standalone DLC. It's part of gaming's most talked about yearly franchises alongside other games like Assassin's Creed, Battlefield, and of course Call of Duty. Looking at the franchise today and solely judging it on its current offering, we can often forget how far Far Cry has become, what it once was, and which titles helped establish the critical identity of, well, a Far Cry game. Because Far Cry was once a much different experience than anything we've played recently. Initially created in 2004 by Crytek, who would later go on to develop Crysis 3 years later, the original Far Cry may not be what you imagine. If I hadn't told you this was the original game, you may not have known this was Far Cry. Far Cry was a pretty linear video game. It featured 20 or so distinct levels, unlike the large, open expanses of a Far Cry game we've come to know and love today. A sunburst Africa, a tropical jungle, Curats, or the wide expanse of a location like Montana. You had a little bit of freedom, but nothing like we know today from a Far Cry game. Far Cry was a testing ground designed to blend the past with a potential future, action with narrative, linearity with a small degree of openness. The latter being the catalyst for change in the follow-up. Far Cry 2 scratched off the former to take its story into a much more large and open, hostile world. I definitely enjoyed Far Cry 2, although the missions were often spaced way too far apart, and you could get yourself into the I'm just wandering around mode pretty quickly. It lacked an interesting premise and provocative characters to spice up the journey as well. A great game, but definitely in need of some work. The first 2 Far Cry games proved to harbor a lot of great ideas, but many of them just weren't panning out. Ubisoft was searching for the right combination of action, open world, RPG-style progression, linearity and storytelling, and most importantly, villains to light the way, but they hadn't quite hit the mark yet. In each game, there was a mix of good and bad, from Far Cry being a little bit too streamlined and clunky, to Far Cry 2 being too aimless and requiring the player to construct his or her own fun via the playground of Africa. Far Cry 3 was when they finally figured it out. Far Cry 3 brought everything that makes a great Far Cry game together. It brought the fragmented, half-finished, or crudely integrated ideas of the franchise into one whole. Action gameplay driven by adaptive player feedback, choice, and reactionary-style combat scenarios. A world that was large and full of things to do, but not too large and aimless. A story that kept moving forward with the help of a very strong villain.
I said, get the fuck out of here, you chicken fuck!
And streamlined RPG-esque character skill and crafting progression. Up until Far Cry 3, those elements were the goal, but they hadn't quite been reached until this game came around. What I really saw from the first 3 entries of Far Cry was a clear understanding of this, and an urgent desire to continue to strive for improvement and refinement. Far Cry was a franchise that got a little bit better with each new game. A great video game stands the test of time, and the beauty of Far Cry 3 is that it's still fun to play today, because it may very well be the best version of Far Cry on the market. Still. Voss does a great job jumping out at you from the beginning with his frightening dialogue and his violence. He's a homicidal maniac, lighting the backdrop of a dark and mature story. The perfect fit.
We're gonna find him, we're gonna free the others, and then we're going home.
He provides the backbone for the best Far Cry introduction in any game, killing Jason's brother, thereby instilling the player with a desire to seek revenge, kill Voss, and discover the strange mysteries of the island. Voss shows up repeatedly through the story, which compels us to constantly check in with the main objective of the game and make sure we have a reason not to get too sidetracked with Far Cry 3's various open world distractions, and there are many. What gripped me about Far Cry 3 is that it had everything I wanted from Far Cry 2, the ability to raid outposts, wander the land in a vehicle, and shoot up pretty much whatever I wanted, but with a much better story on top. It cleaned up the movement system, the animations, and the clunkiness from Far Cry 1 as well. It's not a 10 out of 10 game by any means, but nor is any other Far Cry game. I don't like the first cutscene of the game, the psychedelic moments, or the fact that Jason Brody has the ability to shoot a machine gun in his first try better than a Navy SEAL, but that's just the way a Far Cry game is. Enjoying Far Cry requires one to accept the dissonance created from such extremes, knowing that they are just part of the experience, not the entire game though. It's ridiculous that Jason can skin a tiger in 2 seconds or murder an entire army of pirates without breaking so much as a sweat. I'll definitely give you that. And within minutes of Grant's death, Jason transforms into a superhero with no heed to basic human emotion. It's definitely weird. But a good Far Cry game treads this line of absurdness with mature storytelling, giving you a story that's fun and exciting and driven by a villain like Voss, so long as you accept the circus-like extremes the game goes to. The main issue of Far Cry as a franchise is that the games do get repetitive if the story is not good, the villain isn't good, or the world isn't built correctly. Far Cry requires the right combination of downtime, unique scenario-style playground gameplay, and structured linear story missions. We saw this play out in the absolutely awful Far Cry Lost on Mars recently, showing how boring and uninteresting a Far Cry game can actually be if it's not populated with the right components. As more Far Cry games were made, so was the scale. Far Cry 4 and 5 are bigger games, but they also lost a little bit of the magic that I felt was core to Far Cry 3. Because at every turn of Far Cry 3's story, there's a reason to get involved. You'll run into Voss and harbor memories of your dying brother. You'll blow up a safe house and set fire to a field of drugs for nothing more than just pure satisfaction. Far Cry 3 offers great diversity, allowing players to take in what they want and ignore what they do not. And when they are forced to interact with the main narrative, it's actually really good. And that's the key to a good Far Cry game. You can hunt and craft to your heart's content, climb every radio tower you see, or don't, or just make a general mess of the island by blowing up every outpost you see. Like the best of Grand Theft Auto, it's the downtime that matters, providing you a distraction from the story, so when you go back to it, you feel compelled to play it because you've had some time to decompress. The only fatal flaw with Far Cry 3 is that Voss gets killed off way too soon, about halfway through the game. He's replaced by Hoyt, who can't quite match his phenomenal performance that we had gotten used to for the past 10 hours. But the roller coaster leading up to this moment was the perfect blend of free-roaming adventure and linear scripted storytelling. And that's why Far Cry 3 is the best in the franchise, because it had the right mixture of each component, doled out in the right amount. It's when you line up Far Cry 3 next to other games in the franchise that you appreciate what this was. Some Far Cry games are better than others, while the rest fall victim to either being over or underindulging in what makes the Far Cry franchise compelling or boring. Far Cry 3 had the right mix. It was also the tipping off point for franchise fatigue. After Far Cry 3, the franchise became just another yearly franchise, I think. As time went on, the secrets, quirks, and tricks of the Far Cry formula spilled out into many other games. Giant open-world games became the norm, among various other things. Crafting and upgrading skills, pseudo-RPG-style skill trees, climbing a tower to access a new part of the map, free-roaming adaptive first-person combat, and a map that looks exactly like this, these things were everywhere. The qualities that were once unique to Far Cry became the standard for the rest of the industry. Every game you seemed to turn to had elements of a Far Cry game, not the least of which its follow-up titles. At some point, at least for me, the allure of a Far Cry game just washed away, and the franchise became just another open-world first-person shooter. I never got excited at the prospect of playing the next 2 Far Cry games, although I do appreciate what they were trying to achieve. Some form of uniformity and consistency to appease the fans that had come to love the blueprint of Far Cry 3. Like many people, I overindulged with Far Cry, Call of Duty, and the rest of the yearly franchises on the market. My excitement began to abate, fizzling out like a balloon that lost its air supply. And eventually, Far Cry just became a guilty pleasure for me. Far Cry 3, though, was a special game, during a special time, before the open world boom would become an exhaustive routine that fertilized the DNA of damn near every good idea on the market. Far Cry may be drifting off into a land where it's overstaying its welcome to many people, but it's still a franchise impacting the landscape of game development today in a big way. And knowing that, I'll always remember Far Cry 3 for being the best in the franchise.